A warm welcome to everybody. It is really good to see all of you here. This is really one of the first occasions after a couple of years that we have to meet with all the partners of the project, so we really value this opportunity a lot. And of course, we have a lot of people connected, so a warm welcome also to those that are attending remotely. So first of all, let me introduce myself. For those that do not know me, my name is Nicoletta Pirozzi. I'm the head of the European Union program at the Rome-based Institute for International Affairs, and I had the pleasure and the honor to be the coordinator of this amazing EU IDEA project, EU Integration and Differentiation for Effectiveness and Accountability, a project that started in 2019, funded by the European Commission program Horizon 2020. And it is a project that has involved a lot of think tanks, academic institutions, experts, research centers within and outside the European Union. We were 15 partners, and all of them are represented here at this conference today. So this project will finish at the end of April. This is our concluding event. This conference named Governing Differentiation and Integration in the European Union. I have to say that when we started the project back in 2019, January 2019, we thought that Brexit was the main challenge for European integration. Then we got a global pandemic, COVID, that put a lot of strain also to our project. And then lately, unfortunately, the war in Ukraine. So yeah, we tried basically to adjust our project also to face the new circumstances and try to integrate in our analysis the new European and international situation. I think that the basic claim of the project still holds. We started from the assumption that flexibility and differentiation have been in the DNA of the European Union since its beginning, and they are still valid as a way forward for European integration. And in fact, we started with the view of testing this basic assumption, namely if differentiation can really be a necessary element to address the necessary the challenges that the European Union is facing more effectively. We assume that flexibility can be such an instrument as long as it is compatible with the European Union funding values and constitutional identity of the European Union, as long as it is sustainable in terms of governance, and also as long as it is acceptable to EU citizens, but also to member states and to partners affected by the differentiated policies. And basically we try to test it in a different way, and the way we structure the conference very much mirrors the structure of the project itself. We will start now with a session, a first session on the history of differentiation and the philosophical foundation behind the concept of differentiation. This is something we have investigated deeply also in our project in order to understand which are the main ideas underpinning the concept of differentiation in the European Union. We will go on by addressing differentiation in different policy sectors. This was one of the main characteristics of our project. We tried to make a policy-oriented analysis. So in our project, we try to understand how differentiation has been applied in sectors such as economic and monetary union, single market, but also foreign security and defense policy, and justice, home affairs, and migration. So our experts in the second session will try to address also this issue. Then we will have a nice moment together for our aperitif tonight, where we'll welcome the two winners of our Brexit Award, a nice contest that we had in the framework of the project to understand how young people felt about Brexit and what this meant to their life and how this affected also their ability to express themselves. So we will have this nice moment together. And then tomorrow we will go deeper into the Brexit process, looking not so much about what has been done by the European Union, but mainly looking about the future and how this will mean for the external relations of the European Union and the future of the relationship with the UK. And then we will have a final session as the project is concerned, which is also a crucial element in our project. It is about democracy, accountability, legitimacy, and the participation of citizens. We should not forget that in the framework of the project, during the project, we had an unprecedented experience within the European Union, the Conference on the Future of Europe, which was designed as an ambitious process to involve the citizens in the choices of the European Union. We know that the results did not match exactly the initial expectations, but still there is something to talk about and to see how this intersects our research about differentiated integration. And then we will close with two final sessions, one with Herman Van Rompuy and Vivier Schmidt, talking about a differentiated Europe in the current international reality. And finally, we will have the pleasure to host Commission Reinders, who will address mainly the issue of rule of law and its relationship with differentiated integration in the EU. So a full program which very much reflects the structure of the project. In this conference, we will try to share as much as possible the outcome, the results of the research we have been conducting during these 3 years and a half. We will do it with our experts, but also with the many stakeholders at the institutional level and also the members of our advisory board that were kind enough to accompany us during this process, and which we would like to thank very much for all the advice and comments they made to our work. So if you agree, without further ado, I think we can start the first session. All the speakers are already here. Marco Brunazzo, professor from the University of Trento, Jim Close, Secretary General of TEPSA, John Erik Fossum, professor at the University of Oslo, Ingrid Shikova, professor at the Sofia University, but she was also part of our advisory board, and Piero Tortora, assistant professor at the University of Groningen. So this first session, as I was saying, is dedicated to the history and narratives around differentiation and the influence they have in the state of play of the European Union at the moment. So I would start, if you agree, with a broad initial question to all of you, asking you, looking back at the history of the European Union and its integration process, how have the history and narrative about differentiation impacted and influenced today's European Union? This is just to break the ice, and then we will go on with our conversation. Maybe Marco, you would like to start with a first comment on that?
Hello, good morning. Let me first of all say that I am very happy to be to be here today. Last time I was in Brussels, as many of you, I think, was for the midterm review of the project. So it's very, very. I am very happy to be here for the end of the project. You already answered to your question, Nicoletta, by saying that differentiated integration was really in the DNA of the European Union since its beginning, and the fact that political scientists arrived later to discover the concept of European integration is not because European integration was not already there, but because maybe sometimes we don't pay too much attention to what is going on in the political debates on the future of Europe. And we don't pay too much attention to the documents produced by the EU institutions. For example, differentiated integration was already in the Treaty of Rome, and many articles of the treaties promote a form of differentiated integration under the form of derogation to a specific part of the treaties, the adoption of part of the treaties. For example, in the Treaty of Rome, it was written that the Benelux country could adopt a form of closer cooperation outside the EU legal framework, what it was written in the Treaty of Rome. There was derogations over the application of certain specific norms on countries whose development was lagging behind. For example, I assume that the government at that time looked at mainly at the condition of Italian southern region, but there was derogations also for Germany because, for example, Germany had a different fiscal policy toward the goods imported from Eastern Germany, or different trade policy for the import of bananas. Don't ask me why, but for sure, as you already said, there was a lot of form of differentiated integration since the beginning. And in the political debate, differentiated integration emerged later, around the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s in particular, something that it was under the surface in a way. It is not by chance that the historians tell us that one of the main contributions, one of the starting point of the debate about differentiated integration was this reserved quasi-secret meeting between the French president of the Republic, Charles de Gaulle, and the British ambassador, Christopher Somes in Paris, in which de Gaulle proposed the directoire, according to which France, Italy, Germany, and eventually UK could have played a leading role in the integration process. But at the beginning, there was no narrative about differentiated integration, because the narrative was we need to integrate. We don't need differentiation, because we need to go together toward an ambitious project of integration. So and the narrative of integration, of differentiated integration, emerged when there was the need to complement, let's say, two other narratives, the narratives of the deepening of the EU and the narrative of enlargement. So differentiated integration emerged as a way to cope with the problem of the heterogeneity produced by the different point of views of the member states toward the, let's say, inevitable deepening of the EU and the inevitable enlargement. So, okay, today, I think today differentiated integration is a powerful narrative for two main questions. First of all, for a domestic, let's say, internal question. It's a way to cope with growing heterogeneity, for sure, among the member states of the EU. But the second reasons of the importance of the narrative of differentiation today is the external relations of the EU. So differentiation is a way to offer alternative to candidate countries that want to apply, that want to enter the European Union. So it's an alternative to the full membership.
Thanks, Marco. So, Piero, you were the leader of this work package of the project tackling history and narratives of differentiation. So what's your take on this?
I would like to follow up what Marco was saying, actually. We started this project by observing that, Marco was saying something important, that differentiation, historically speaking, was seen for probably most of the history of European integration as a bit of a glitch, right? A malfunction rather than a proactive strategy. And when we started this project, on the other hand, pretty much differentiated integration was the name of the game, right? It was, on the other hand, so much so that there was the famous white paper with the 5 scenarios, differentiated integration being one of them. And more generally, DI was taken more as a proactive strategy to sort out certain problems in European integration. What I would like to point out now, following up on what Marco was saying, is a bit of a provocation, if you allow me. And considering everything that has happened between when we started the project and today, much of which you already mentioned, namely COVID, the war in Ukraine, and the completion of Brexit, I wonder, and this is again more of a question than an answer, as is often the case when I speak, whether we are seeing the beginning of, at least at the level of narrative, and at least implicitly, a return to a more, let's say, unified integration narrative. Why? Factually and normatively, right? On the one hand, Brexit, for one thing, Brexit, eliminated, took away one of the main sources of differentiated integration in the EU. COVID was a very symmetrical crisis, right? Unlike the Eurozone crisis, which brought about very symmetrical responses, very unified responses. The new generation EU is a very undifferentiated response to COVID. The war in Ukraine is a bit of I think there are mixed messages there, and we can discuss them later. Some in the direction of unified responses, some more recently in the direction of there seems to be cleavages that are re-emerging quite quickly, politically speaking. But on the whole, I think that, I wonder, and again, this is probably less a statement than a question, whether we can see, historically speaking, looking at current history, current affair, a bit of a step back from that trajectory that I mentioned earlier, from, differentiation integration as a malfunction to a proactive strategy. Are we going back to a narrative, a position, let's say a depiction and a strategy of integration that is more traditional in a sense? That is factually, right? There are things there. There are moves, there are policies, new institutions that have been created that are very undifferentiated. And then normatively speaking, you said, and rightly so, you started by saying that differentiated integration, one of the messages of our project and initial assumptions is that are aware that differentiated integration is a good solution, is a response, is an answer to problems so long as it is compatible with citizens' opinion, public opinion, the founding values of the European Union, and the, let's say, the paradigm of European integration, so long as it doesn't damage, so to speak, the paradigm of European integration. And the second part of my provocation is asking whether we are also moving towards a less differentiated narrative in European integration, also normatively speaking, whereby instances of doing less, remember the Juncker scenario, right? Who wants to do more, who wants to do more does more, and wants to do less does less. I'm wondering whether doing less is, especially in some instances, I'm thinking especially about the war in Ukraine and the reactions of the EU to that new crisis, whether doing less is less and less tolerated or seen less and less compatible with the project as a whole. Okay, and this goes together also with there seems to be, and again, this is something that we'll be able to see only in future years, a reforming of clear-cut blocks in the world. And to the extent that that is true, then the necessity, the need to belong to a bloc, in this case, the European Union, more clearly and without any, let's say, nuance, is more, it's more needed, politically speaking. So that's my provocation, my questions for perhaps for later, for the later discussion.
We will come back to that. But Jim, maybe you can start also responding to this provocation. You had the opportunity to be, a privileged observer of, not only observer, but also active protagonist of the process of integration and differentiation of the EU from the Secretariat of the EU Council. What is your assessment?
Thank you very much, Nicoletta, and congratulations for this project, which I think has revealed a lot of interesting things and which is quite topical today. I'll explain why I say this. I have 5 remarks. The first one is that differentiation was not as such really created by the treaty. It was, of course, there were some hooks initially in the treaty in terms of transition periods and all of that. But otherwise, it arose out of necessity. And the necessity across the board has been more integration. In fact, differentiation has been consistently used to go towards more integration because it was an instrument, to allow certain member countries that were not able to participate or didn't want to participate to catch up later on. So that's a very important point. And I'll come back to this because there was one instant more recently, and you referred indirectly to this, when it was suddenly seen maybe as a possible instrument of disintegration, and it failed miserably. So that's my first remark. The second remark is it took, of course, very different shapes. Why? Because it was born out of pragmatism. It shows, incidentally, the flexibility of the European Union over the years, because each time we found a different way. Now, I don't talk about the transition periods because that was foreseen in the treaty. Schengen was a very interesting indication. Now, Schengen looked like a counter project to the European Union, but it wasn't actually. That was purely a methodological point. You couldn't abolish the borders at the time via the EU treaty or the EC treaties. So we did it outside, but the Commission was always associated, and it was always made clear that sooner or later this should get into the treaty, which it did with the Amsterdam Treaty. That's an important point. The euro is a very interesting aspect of differentiation because that's a conscious use of differentiation in the treaty, the same objective, but a staggered approach towards the third part. And of course, already the slightly less appealing opt-outs of the Danes and the Swedes and the British. Defense and security, well, their differentiation is congenital. It's a given. Why? Because the treaty recognizes the NATO adherence of the majority of the member countries and respects the neutrality status of others. So you have a natural differentiation. Later on, with the creation of PESCO, we introduced an instrument in terms of developing modalities. My third point is, because of this development, there have been various terms used, flexibility, staggered approach, l'Europe à plusieurs vitesses, geometry, and all of this. It's interesting that when it was decided at some stage to put it into the treaty, we used enhanced cooperation, which is a very neutral term. Now, the interesting thing about it is, as when it was introduced into the treaty, it was at the behest of the countries who wanted to use it. But actually, this discussion then led to a situation where it's the ones who were afraid of being left out who dominated the debate. And so it became a very, very inflexible instrument, was actually, as such, practically never used. So this is also an interesting remark. My fourth remark is, I mentioned this before, there was some talk in the crisis, which started in 2008, to maybe use some form of disintegration as differentiating. I mean, that was the debate about Brexit, for instance, as far as the euro is concerned. The fact of the matter, though, is, and you made this point, I absolutely agree with this, ever since 2008, every single crisis has revealed fault lines in our organization, and the answer inevitably has been each time more integration. And they're talking about areas where everybody actually recognized the need to be more integrated. So it's a counter. And so in that sense, a year ago, 2 years ago, I was being asked, is this an instrument? I said, not at all. Today, I have a slightly different opinion because of the developments of Ukraine and around Ukraine. Now, one of the developments which was less instrumental and more substantial is the opt-out, of course, and the whole debate about a core Europe. The opt-outs are dangerous. We've seen what happened with the Brits. From opt-out, they staggered from opt-out to opt-out, and in the end, they opted out of the whole bloody thing. So that's something which is not very... The core Europe debate was an interesting one. Schäuble, Lamas, it was the Balladur idea of a conference, all of this. This always failed because there was no willingness on the part who were supposed to be left outside to be left outside. So my final remark is, and this is something which I want to put on the table as a thought, and that is the following. We are talking now about the possible adherence, accession of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. I think this is a very difficult issue. What I do think, I'm just sort of struggling with this. I think this idea of concentration, a core, and then concentrations with different levels of integration actually might come in handy. We should think about this because for two reasons. One is this, whatever people say, this process will be a complicated and long process. So meanwhile, some people are talking about a staged process, and this could actually help us intellectually, maybe, to develop this staged progress by consciously using a differentiated approach. My final remark, which will not please everybody, is that maybe, I mean, I'm not certain that Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova will enter. I don't know. If ever, at the end, they cannot enter, then I do believe that something like what was proposed years ago as a possible model for running things in Europe for associating countries without being fully members, to be very closely associated, is actually worth coming back to. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. This is very relevant and also part of our preliminary findings of the project. So I'm sure we will come back to that also during the debate. Ingrid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicoletta. Dear colleagues, I come from Eastern Europe. I share this because I think it's very important to know our point of view. But before answering the question, I'd like to stress that I'm a dreamer. And if, let's say, 30 years ago, somebody has predicted that Bulgaria would be member of the European Union, that I would be professor in European studies at Sofia University, And that today I'll be with representatives of the most prestigious European think tanks, institutes, and universities, I would never believe it. I'm very frank with this. This in the context of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. I'd like to thank, of course, for the opportunity to be part of the advisory board. It was really an opportunity to follow this, the agenda of this project, very rich, and thank you very much for this. And also congratulations for your professionalism and for your dedication. Because in order to really implement such a project, you need a lot of efforts and a lot of dedication. Congratulations, of course, to everybody, but especially to you, Nicoletta, because you was the driving force of this project, especially during this COVID pandemic with all the difficulties. Now, differentiated integration always interested me because it's a very sensitive issue in Eastern Europe and especially in Bulgaria. In practice, differentiated integration, I think, is about interests and opportunities. And you are right that flexibility has always played a very important role in European integration. And the European Union will not escape from this differentiated integration in the future. I'm sure that those who would like, who want to do more, will do more, but also those who would like to do less will do less. And this is also very important. Tolerance for this differentiated integration should be, I think, within certain limits. Otherwise, it will be difficult for European integration in the future. I would mention only 3 points which are related more with the current situation as a result from the past. The first point is that we need a positive balance of differentiated integration. When I talk about differentiated integration, I always mention the Roman god Janus. As you know, Janus has double face, looks at the past and looks to the future, the god for the beginnings and endings, etc. Why do I mention Janus? Because the differentiated integration also has 2 faces, both positive and negative. And if we read all the papers and books about differentiated integration, which is almost impossible, because really there are a lot of, let's say, papers on this, we will see that this differentiated integration is both overestimated or heavily criticized. And we can see this double face. For some member states, I think that differentiated integration is a mean for deepening the integration, and you are right on this. But for others, this differentiated integration is a very convenient instrument for withdrawing from some, let's say, embarrassing policies. And this is my first point. We need a positive balance, otherwise we will have difficulties. Second, about the narrative. I must say that especially in Eastern Europe and more concretely in Bulgaria, the narrative for differentiated integration creates a sense of isolation and detachment. All this multi-speed, two-speed, core Europe, etc., it is not accepted in a positive way, and it creates such sense of isolation. According, let's say, to a mini opinion poll I did, we did a seminar in Bulgaria for young diplomats. Let's say enhanced cooperation is more accepted than multi-speed Europe or core Europe and periphery, etc. That is why I think that words count. If we compare with Ukraine, because Ukraine is now an important issue, a military operation and a war is, let's say, there is a difference among these narrative words, and the difference is important. That is why I think that what we do not like is, let's say, closed door. Because sometimes this differentiation is about exclusion and about, let's say, second-class citizens. The feeling, at least the feeling, or the perception. This was my second, let's say, remark. And my third remark is that membership in the European Union is becoming an increasingly complex task. It requires much more efforts. Maybe it was easier at the beginning with 6 member states, now with 27, with this differentiated integration and differentiated integration in the future. The national authorities, and I always say this to our national authorities, the task is very complex. It's not so easy because this differentiated integration needs cautious implementation. And I compare it to a medicine. If you exceed the dose of the medicine, it becomes a poison. That is why I think that membership in the European Union and the differentiated integration should have the task really to contribute to the cooperation and to the integration and not to divide the countries. And I'll stop here.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much, Ingrid. I think it was very interesting also that you pointed out both on the value of narratives and have a correct narrative on differentiation, but also the red lines we should identify in order to make it the right way, let's say. That was also part of our reflections. So, John-Eric, it's your turn. And by the way, I already started to receive questions from the connected audience. You have the Q&A function you can use. I will collect a few questions and then put them to our speakers, but of course also the people that are here are allowed to pose questions. But first of all, allow me to give the floor to John-Eric, who has been also very present in our research. John-Eric is the coordinator of a sister project of EU-IDEA, EU3D. So John-Eric, we're really pleased to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta. And I'm actually an outsider in 2 senses, because from the sister project, and I say sister project, because I'm extremely happy with how we have collaborated. One would normally think that when you have several projects, they would be violent competitors, but we have not been. We are also together in the DICE consortium, which is one. So I think we are building on strength by collaborating. And actually, I think there's also, as I will say, there's a certain division of labor between us that I think is also fruitful in this. And we are benefiting from your work also because we end our project in July next year. So I'm very pleased to be here, to be invited. And I'm saying invited also is because I'm also an outsider since I am part of a non-member state. that is closely affiliated with the European Union and also has been invited to partake in very many of the European Union's policies and so forth. So, I mean, in that sense, it also shows the European Union's inclusiveness in that. And there is a lot to be said about this external differentiation. But I'll stick more to the internal because of the history and narratives. I think that the European Union is imbued with a culture of accommodation from the very beginning. So the very notion of the EU as a consensus building system was one that it inherited also from the member states that built it up because they were consensus democracies. So you look at the way in which the European Union decision-making process is structured, it is one of sounding out different interests and concerns to come up with some kind of broader consensus. So I think that's a culture of accommodation that is in it from the very beginning in the European Union, and that also is, of course, is related to the central role of the European Union in ensuring reconciliation between former enemies, and this has, of course, been an extremely successful process. So I think there's a culture in this that should not be downplayed. Now, when it comes to differentiation, I think that there are two narratives in this. One is the differentiated integration. And I think that is a narrative more of deviation, derogation, and exception, and so on, very much in relation to laws and rules. And that is the main narrative that you two projects have basically been dealing with. The other narrative that my project is also bringing in and wants to juxtapose to this differentiated integration narrative is the more sociological, the more macro and classical sociology understanding of differentiation as an intrinsic element of modernization. So that as political systems become modern and complex, they become more differentiated. So this has to do with the specialization, and it also has to do with democracy, which is one of the concerns that we are examining, because democracy requires a division of powers. An independent judiciary is absolutely fundamental for the functioning of a democracy, as we see in those cases that do not respect this, notably in the European Union, Hungary and Poland. And those are not democracies, and they can use whatever label they want, but they are not democracies. So that type of differentiation of functions is an essential precondition for democracy to function. So in that sense, some forms of differentiation are essential for the functioning of modern societies, and democracy relies on them, and other forms are not. So we are trying to find a sorting mechanism to say what forms of differentiation are viable, and how do these two narratives actually relate to each other, this more deviation narrative versus this more, you could call it specialization narrative, or containing power narrative. So these two narratives, I think, need to be configured, and we have a bit more time in my project, so I'm hoping to be able to further this discussion and in collaboration with you on doing so. And when it comes to the differentiated integration, I think this could be that since the European integration process is so much an integration through law, that it has had a higher visibility and maybe also salience for the political system, this notion of differentiated integration, because law is particularly allergic to deviations and so on. And if you had more capability, you would have been able to deal with a number of problems and so on without having to go into differentiating in rules and norms and so on. So I think this also has to do with the European Union's own development of own capabilities and capacities. The fact that it has been very much constrained, that the member states have continuously emburdened it with tasks and so on, and expectations, and citizens as well, but they haven't actually been forthcoming with the resources that are necessary for doing so. So you have a expectations capability gap in the European Union in that sense. And I think that more capability actually would have helped the European Union not to have to differentiate in rules and provisions and so on in institutional arrangements, because it could have dealt with this through fiscal means in a more smooth way that normally states do. I mean, there's a lot of accommodation or difference and so on that goes on in states, but it does through various forms of mechanisms that don't need to lend themselves in law. So the visibility of this is higher in the European Union. That's an element of weakness, not strength, actually, in that sense.
Thank you so much, John Eric. I don't know if there is already somebody that would like to ask a question to our speakers. Otherwise, let me start with the first question we received through our Q&A function. So very good point on tolerance for differentiation. If we agree that so far differentiation flexibility was more or less temporary to allow the reality all member states to travel in the same direction but at different speeds, then the key question is whether flexibility that would allow a turning back from that same direction can be accepted, tolerated. The example are countries such as Hungary or Poland, actively, openly changing direction or backsliding on key issues. Or will the peer pressure or external threats be enough to ensure that such changes of direction remain temporary? So I don't know if you got the question, but it's about this, also the red lines we were talking about before. And okay, we will go back to the other questions later. But I have also a couple of questions from the audience. I will collect them and then come back to the speakers. Please, Emmanuel. Sorry, the micro is coming. And if you can introduce yourself.
Yes, I am Emmanuel Pont. I worked in the framework of the Work Package 6 on Schengen matters. So thank you for the presentation. I have a question for Marco on the history of the differentiated integration. And to some extent, one could say that the European community itself was a form of differentiated integration from the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which collapsed a few years later. But some negotiations that could not go through inside the OEC went through inside a smaller framework, which was the EEC, which gave rise to the European Union as we know it. And my question is, I was wondering, I cannot even, because you were talking about bananas and so on, and I was wondering, is there any, and even any, EU negotiation or EC negotiation that did not use differentiation? I am wondering about that. A negotiation in which there was no exception, no progressive development of rules among members, immediate uniformity. I cannot see of any.
Thanks. Another question, please. Please.
Yes, my name is Paul Christoffersen. I'm a former Danish permanent representative. And since we are talking about differentiation, I was working more or less, as Jim has been working in the Council Secretariat when we made the Danish opt-out. And I agree very much with what Jim said, that this was not something we wanted, but it was out of necessity. We had a treaty, there was a Danish no. If that treaty should be saved, we had to find a solution. And the points which we had to draw out of the potential opt-outs were not necessarily the points that had played a great role in the Danish referendum, but these were just the things we could find which would allow the process to go forward, which meant that it was something that could be done without changing the treaty at hand. So, I mean, this was not a great philosophy or a great deviation into another direction. It was sheer necessity. And the same thing in Amsterdam. Why did the UK obtain the opt-outs on the Home and Justice Affairs? Because that was a condition for integrating Schengen into the treaty. So we had the choice: either you make a treaty with Schengen in it, or you make a treaty where you give an opt-out to the UK. So it has been out of necessity. And then when you look at the result, even with all the opt-outs, the UK didn't stay, while Denmark has been staying with all the opt-outs, even though they doesn't make sense today, and where you see that if you're looking at the Europe barometers, Denmark is the country which has the highest supporter of European integration. I think 85% of the Danes today thinks that European integration is a good thing. So basically, I agree very much with Jim, as you can hear.
Do you have a question also?
The question is whether you need to find a new model because of the three new candidates. And I suppose that if a model is necessary, it will also include probably the Balkan countries. There, I think if we are looking for a model, we should be looking, and it's more common, but maybe a model like the model which we found for Romania and Bulgaria and Schengen, so that you only become full member of certain policy areas when you fulfill certain conditions. That I could see as a model that would be a form of differentiated integration. But Europe in different speeds, inner circle, outer circle, forget it. And as it was always also said by one of the speakers, today, when we have shown an impressive solidarity on Brexit, on COVID, and on Ukraine, it really is a strange moment to be talking about splitting apart. Sorry for...
It's okay. Thank you. So let me go back to the speakers and so they can reply to questions and comments. Jim, would you like to start as this last one was?
This is interesting. I mean, of course, since Paul agrees with me, I agree with him. So I mean, this goes without saying. But we've had many. We've had many battles. No, there were some interesting things which were said. I just briefly want to come back to those. I think your point on as a Bulgarian is perfectly understood, that sometimes differentiation is seen as being locked out, and you mentioned Schengen. The Bulgarians and the Romanians consider that they are wrongfully excluded. My point I wanted to make, and it goes a bit in the sense of what Paul just now said, maybe think about a new model as far as probably the Balkans are concerned and those three countries. You know, in the case of Schengen, this is seen as a closed door, but actually you should be able to explain to people that what you're doing if you introduce certain criteria is that you create an open door. You create a possibility to join. Now, I know in the Bulgarian-Romanian case, there is, of course, a disagreement because the technical requirements have been fulfilled. And it was actually recognized by the Commission, and yet some member countries blocked. So it's a border case. It's a complicated case. The second remark I'd like to make very briefly is, of course, no one wants to be excluded, and that's why it has been so difficult in the past, core Europe or to do this kind of thing. You've seen it when PESCO was launched. I mean, PESCO was a typical area where there should not have been so many member countries involved because it was about being serious about doing defense. Now, 25 out of 27 in the end I was very much against it because it shows that it's not very serious. But it was a purely political issue. The same. You hardly nowadays have meetings only of the Eurogroup. We always associated the others because simply they didn't want to be excluded. My last remark is about the following. Differentiation, even according to the Amsterdam Treaty, has to be limited. And for instance, it cannot apply in exclusive areas of competence, rightly so, because you cannot start differentiating there because then the internal market collapses. But for me, basic key values which are defined in the treaties cannot either be split. So there's no question of using differentiation to say whether you are in favor of human rights or rule of law or not. It's completely out of the question. We should not even discuss this, in my view, because otherwise we're really going down a very bad route. And lastly, on your question, yes, there are many issues where we work without differentiation. You simply have to take the tool of regulation, which applies directly in all the countries. So there are many, many issues. Again, no one woke up one morning and said, let's do differentiation. People woke up in the morning and said, how do we do integration? And then they woke up one day and say, what are you going to do with the bloody Danes and the British and others? They block the whole thing. So let's do differentiation so that we can continue integrating. And that's exactly how it worked. Thank you.
Thanks. Marco, do you want to reply to Emmanuel's question?
Maybe because we reflect the culture of accommodation and consensus, I agree with you. In the sense that I do think that as far as I know, all negotiations in the history of the European Union, I would say it's part of it, every negotiation, international negotiation, to provide also derogations and other mechanisms for accommodating different interests and point of view of the actors. So every negotiation in the European Union also promotes forms of differentiation, but at the same time, what is specific to the European Union, I think, maybe because of what Jim was saying, is that differentiation challenge the idea of integration somehow, and this is why in the European Union, I think, the concept of differentiation has always seen as I don't want to say problematic, but as a challenge for integration. That maybe at the beginning was not like this. I mean, at the beginning was just, okay, we all proceed in the same way, and we provide derogation to specific issues. I mentioned banana. I could mention also, I don't know, the green coffee derogations for Italy. So very specific. But at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, these specific derogations led the debate toward, more significant, more meaningful concept, like, what is the European Union? How can we cope with the heterogeneity of the European Union? So is differentiated integration produce disintegration instead of differentiation? So this is very specific, I think, to the European Union project, so into the European Union negotiation.
Thanks, Marco. I give the floor to Ingrid. I know, Ingrid, you want to make a comment, but also I have an additional question that we received. If you think there is the case for a more structured relationship between the EU and countries which aspire to eventual membership of the EU, but which are not in the position to commit to the obligations involved, since you were talking about narratives and limits.
Yes, first I'd like to comment on Schengen and Bulgaria and Romania, because this is really a sensitive issue in Bulgaria. And I think that this is a very good example of, let's say, implementation of differentiated integration, at the same time not guaranteed the so-called permeability. Because I think that in order to have a positive balance of the differentiated integration, we need some permeability. It means that if some countries have started a differentiated project, more and more countries should join when they are ready to do this, and not to put new criteria, because this is the case with Bulgaria and Romania and Schengen. I have participated in the Bulgarian negotiations for accession, and in our treaty for accession, it's written that Bulgaria will join Schengen when Bulgaria fulfills the technical requirements. The European Commission has confirmed that Bulgaria has fulfilled these requirements, and in June 2011, the European Parliament voted the first resolution for the, let's say, acceptance of Bulgaria and Romania in Schengen. After that, there are 5 other resolutions. And till today, Bulgaria and Romania are not members of Schengen. And because of this, yesterday, I almost missed my second plane. Yes, because I needed for the connection flight a new security check, because I'm not coming from a Schengen country. And I lost my watch there because I was in a hurry. These are the results of not being in Schengen. Otherwise, it's not so important, but in some cases it is. That is why I am for this differentiated integration, but with permeability. As to your question, you know that I have a concept, I call it smart integration. And this smart integration could be a new narrative, not call it two-speed, multi-speed, differentiated, whatever. Let's call it, change the narrative and call it smart integration. And I use the so-called goal setting theory, which is used in the management with motivation, with goals. And really, I think it could help the new countries which will join the European Union, but also the member states when, let's say, such decisions should be taken. We don't have enough time to elaborate on this, but I think that there are at least 5 steps to this. First, to decide the strategy. Shall we do an ever closer union or not? Second, which policies are really compulsory for all the member states? Third, which policies could be differentiated? After that, let's say, to see what would be the negative effect of differentiations on the countries which are outside. And the last one, but not least, this is to win the public opinion. And this is very important because in order to fulfill a difficult goal, a difficult objective, we need the support of the citizens. And this is, in my opinion, very important.
Thanks, Ingrid, that you also made a contribution for our project on this that is available on our website. I have a question for John Eric and also Piero. We received this question from the public. I think it is relevant from the research you have done, the two of you, concerning the link between differentiation and multi-level governance. people are asking if this is part of the problem or part of the solution. Increasingly differentiated governance structures on one side, or separate levels of democratic accountability coming together at the EU level. So maybe, John Eric, you can start building on the research you've done in the UE3D project.
Can I take a step back also to say something on the backsliding? Because I think that I've mentioned the two terms of differentiation and democracy in our project, but I haven't said anything about domination yet. So that's the third concept that we are using. And the type of differentiation we see with democratic backsliding has very much to do with domination. Namely that when states roll back the rights of citizens, especially vulnerable citizens, they exercise domination. When they exclude citizens and so forth, they are exercising domination. So this is an unacceptable form of differentiation. So the type of backsliding is on all circumstances associated with domination, and it actually exposes the EU's weakness, its inability to clamp down on these types of things, to allow these forms of domination to happen. I mean, I think the responsibility lies as much with the member states as it lies with the European Union. And I think actually the discourse is somewhat wrong in that sense, that member states should have been more active in doing so, because they claim to be the owners of the Constitution. Then they should own up to the Constitution as well to do so. But okay, I'll leave that aside. On differentiation and multi-level governance, well, I'm personally a federalist, so you would immediately think that there would be limitations to how much type of differentiation you can allow in terms of these forms of deviations. At the same time, federal systems are actually also allowing for asymmetry and so forth. So they build that into the mechanics, because they are also fluid systems in that sense. But these questions, it's multi-level governance is a complex term, because it is both the issue of multi-levels, but it's also about governance versus government. Governance is this sort of non-hierarchical form and mix of private and public. And I have a big problem with the very notion of governance in this sense, because I find it problematic from a democratic perspective in terms of lack of accountability. So that form of flexibility and that was in vogue with the EU's white paper from 2001 and so forth, I found problematic both from a constitutional and a democratic perspective, because it allows for too much fluctuation. And I think it's too rose-tinted, actually. I don't think it is sufficiently up to understanding hierarchical forms of power and entrenched hierarchies that we already have. Multi-level governance for me would have to be situated in forms of government, which have clearer lines of accountability, and that in itself would rein in some form of the flexibility in this. If you apply this to the European Union, it is kind of interesting that it is a two-tracked system with the single market, which is quite unacceptable for differentiated integration, actually. It doesn't allow for too many exemptions and so on, whereas the core state powers areas, in both fiscal power, fiscal and also foreign and security power, are allowing for negotiations, so it is a lopsided system. And I don't think the EU has struck the right balance in between these. I think the EU should have had stronger powers in some of the core state powers, and weaker and opened up, flexibilized somewhat in the single market to allow for less forms of rigid regulation along all the areas of the internal market. But that would have required the European Union to become more like a state, to have a stronger fiscal clout in order to be able to deal with some of the issues without having to legislate on all and use fiscal clout. So that I think that type of flexibility would have been possible, but then you need significantly more fiscal clout than you have currently with the European Union. Okay.
Thanks, John Eric. And Piero, maybe last word to you.
Okay, that's a lot of pressure.
No, maybe, let's see if I can take one.
No, I mean, I'm not going to say much about multi-level governance and differentiation, not because there is not much to say, but because there is too much to say. I mean, these are very complex concepts, and I totally sympathize with John Eric when he questions the concept in the first place. I've been struggling with that concept for a while myself. I mean, what I will say is that, you know, the second hat that I wore in this project is, you know, the first one was as coordinator of the work package 1. The second one was as co-author of a paper in work package 2 on networks of subnational authorities as a form of differentiated, not integration, but cooperation. So that was one example, very tangible example of how we kind of extended the concept of differentiation here. And in that in that capacity, we've made a few observations about the advantages, but also the potential shortcomings of situations in which you cross these networks as participants in multi-level governance with traditional differentiated integration. You know, there are some advantages, some potential for in terms of effectiveness, accountability, democracy, Europeanization, but also can be tricky cases, especially when it comes to, again, accountability, especially when, you know, certain this connects very much to, you know, local level capacities. You know, certain countries, local governments in certain countries simply do not have as much capacity, by which I mean, you know, admin capacity, administrative capacity, political capacity to participate as much in multi-level governance configurations as local governments in other countries. So I think we should also be aware of this, and that sometimes multi-level governance arrangement can also push to some sort of forced differentiated integration when you don't have enough capacity to participate, to enforce this, to implement this multi-level governance as much as we would like, so to speak, ideally, as much as it would be ideally doable. So that, I mean, that's a very complex, it's a very complex area. So that's, I guess I would say this much, and then invite everybody to read that paper for further information. And if I can add something also on the very first question that came from the online audience. I totally agree with Jim. I mean, there's no discussing like differentiation in the area of rule of law, democracy. That's not even a discussion, right? I mean, what are we even doing here if that's if we allow such you know, even temporary derogations? But I do think that especially the war in Ukraine is posing more subtle questions that very often concern the same countries, but not only, and open the question of, you know, how tolerable certain, let's say, derogations, certain differences in positions are. Right? I hope my memory serves me correctly, but I do think that when Russia said, okay, from now on you have to pay for gas in rubles, then the Hungarian government right away said, we're very happy to do that, right? When the official line was different, right, in the rest of the European Union. Same goes for, you know, do we allow weapons to go through the Hungarian territory? I mean, I'm making the example of Hungary because it happens to be more often Hungary. But, you know, of course, there are also questionable positions in Germany, in Italy, about, you know, the possibility of embargoing the gas and so on and so forth. So here, again, it's not a statement, it's more of a question. To what extent do we, you know, do we tolerate those as cases of differentiation? Policy differentiation, temporary differentiation, or do we not? And I think this is the real interesting question today.
Thank you, Piero. Time for one quick last question, and Zora, maybe we will get the microphone. And if you can be short and address it to one of our speakers. Thanks.
Yeah. A very short comment and a question to Mr. Kloss. So my comment was, I completely agree with Professor Shikova about Bulgaria entering the Schengen, but also we don't have to go on the line of victimization, as I come from a country which was again blocked to start accession negotiation. First time was Macedonia, now is as North Macedonia also, although all the conditions were met long time ago. So let's not go that way. And my question to Mr. Kloss was, we were talking about differentiated integration. We have now a new methodology that was pushed for enlargement, was pushed by the French, where there is a specific line on phasing in policies. Do you, and especially now with the war Ukraine and obviously the candidate status, so we will have Ukraine ahead of two countries from the Western Balkans that will be namely Kosovo and Bosnia. So do you see differentiate integration as a way of dealing with the enlargement countries, whoever they be? And can a change kind of a decision-making process, leaving a little bit from unanimity more towards QMV, can help the process? Because there will be always one member state that can, block the process.
I think that those are very different issues.
Okay.
The first issue, my answer is, and I think you listened to what I said initially, and I think what Paul said there, I think we should, I don't have a ready answer for this, but I do think, yes, you've seen that the enlargement process has been changed. And this is why not. I think we should constantly be on the lookout, adapt to reality. Taking in Western Balkans is not the same as taking in Spain and Portugal. There are different situations. Now with Ukraine, the situation changes again. So I do think, without having sort of spelled it out in my own head, we should be looking at those things. The question of qualified majority or unanimity is a different question. There's no way that you're going to change unanimity as far as enlargement is concerned, so just forget about it. And not only that, but ratification in every single member country. And that is the reason why I say, all the people who now say the solution is Ukraine in as quickly as possible, don't dream about this. As quickly as possible, it's not going to work. And you, coming from North Macedonia, see how difficult, how complicated it is, because there's also the adaptability criterion in the EU, which is important, because it's not just a geostrategic issue, it's an existential issue. So there, I don't think you're not going to move on this one. But as I said, I think they're two very different questions.
Thanks, Ingrid, do you have a last
I
word?
would like just to add, not really a question, a comment concerning Ukraine and this questionnaire, which Ursula von der Leyen gave to Zelensky a week ago or 10 days ago because she was in Bulgaria. And frankly said, I was very astonished that this questionnaire was filled up for 1 week. Is it possible?
Part of it.
I remember when Bulgaria received this questionnaire, we worked months, and after that there was such a pile of files to be given to the head of delegation, etc. And my students asked me, but is it possible to fill, because I explained that this questionnaire, there are a lot of questions. Frankly said, I don't know what is, maybe this is a new questionnaire, and it's easy to fill it, but really...
Yeah, again, it is a call for realism on both sides, I would say.
What differentiation is it?
I uncharacteristically expressed myself more.
Jim, you have to use the
No, I'm not a diplomat, I'm an academic, then I could speak what I think.
Thanks, Ingrid, your point was very clear.
And we'll discuss with our Macedonian colleague during the coffee break.
Exactly,
Yes.
thank you, Ingrid. Well, thank you very much to all the speakers. I think this was a very interesting and lively first session. I mean, we started to lay the ground for our further discussions in the next sessions. We learned how differentiation was a pragmatic instrument used by the European Union out of necessity in many cases, but also we learned how it is important to have the right narrative about differentiation to avoid this feeling of isolation that we see in some member states, and also to accommodate the expectations of future members. So a very difficult balance. We will then go to the second session and understand how it works in the different policy sectors. But for the time being, I warmly thank all the speakers and the participants. Thank you very much.